Thank you, Arthur, for such a comprehensive presentation. So now we can start a Q&A. Norman, if you want to go first, feel free. Just wait for the mic because we record all the things we say here.
And it turns out I have this thing, so if you want to ask in Portuguese, apparently that will work. So we'll see.
Arthur, two questions. One, would Brazil be a beneficiary of these frictions between the United States and China? Secondly, what is your view? I mean, you talked about the political and the trade dimensions. What about the military dimensions? How much of a danger? I mean, what comes to mind is something like the Tonkin Bay Institute that started the Vietnam War.
Right.
In
64, yeah.
1964.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think the two sides will be careful? I mean, the Chinese military technology has advanced a great deal to be able to attack enemy ships at a considerable distance. What do you think of the dangers of this kind of confrontation?
Yeah, okay.
Can we get another question?
Yeah, okay, so we'll take a couple of questions and I'll assemble them. Yeah, so next one, yeah.
Arthur, there is a lot of discussions in the United States about the so-called Thucydides trap.
Yes.
By that meaning that rivalry between the United States and China would necessarily develop as far as China is emerging. What is your assessment of these people saying this?
Okay, great. And why don't we take one more and then I'll answer
Anyone else?
if there's another one. Does anyone want to? There's Augusto, do you want to? Oh, there's one over here. Okay.
It's a kind of crazy question, but if Trump, for reasons we know, is impeached, then what changes if Democrats go back to the power or something like that?
Right. Okay, all very good questions. It's not a crazy question because, as I said, it's possible. It could happen. So I'll take them in order. So the impact on Brazil, it's a little complicated. So I think to the extent that the trade officials in the United States have not just an anti-China agenda, but apparently an anti-everyone agenda, that's not good for Brazil, right? I mean, steel and aluminum are things that get exported from here to the United States in some quantities. So we've already had, I think, a negative impact on Brazil from this kind of very broad brush U.S. trade stuff. I think in terms of the rivalry, Brazil, I think geographically has the advantages that they're far from the action, and that's good. And the types of economic interactions that they have with each country are fairly distinct. So I struggle to see a strongly positive or a strongly negative impact in the short run from this. I think in the longer run, if this rivalry continues, clearly one thing that China will try to do is to buy more influence. The Belt and Road theoretically starts with these countries in Central Asia and Southeast Asia, but it really can in principle include anyone in the entire world. And in fact, I think there are lists that have various Latin American countries as being Belt and Road countries. So Brazil is in a position to be a beneficiary of Chinese investment. I know there was a very strong Chinese investment here in 2016, and this went down quite a bit in 2017 for various reasons, some of which relating to policy here and some relating to policy in China. But in the long run, I think Brazil certainly can be a big beneficiary of China's infrastructure plans, its ability to finance these kinds of things, and to the extent that China does have a need to ultimately to open up its agricultural markets because they just are not able to produce everything that they need. Brazil's in a pretty good position from that. I think, on the other hand, if we get to a point where the U.S.-China rivalry is so strong and so intense that it starts to undermine or blow up the global trading system, make the WTO non-functional because the two biggest economies in the world have decided not to play by its rules, then I think that's a problem for Brazil and for everyone else. I think global growth gets hit because it's benefited a lot from freer trade and investment over the years. If we go in reverse on that and barriers to trade and investment keep rising because of this rivalry, then I think that's harmful both for Brazil and for pretty much every other country in the world. Military implications and the Thucydides trap. So I'm not a believer in the Thucydides trap. I have a son who's doing a classics PhD at Yale, and I asked him about Graham Allison's book, and he snorted and said, that guy has obviously never read Thucydides. He doesn't know what he was talking about. I won't get into that particular thing. I think that idea, okay, there's a simple idea, which is that the U.S. and China are distinct geopolitical powers, and they are in a rivalry. Okay, that is very clear. I think this whole construct that there's some sort of inevitable direction between an old power and a new power, there isn't a lot of historical evidence for that. So I think that's kind of an advertising slogan, if you will, to dress up a much more prosaic idea that China is an independent geopolitical power. They are not part of the U.S. security system, unlike Japan and Germany after World War II, which were economically very powerful and often got into economic spats with the United States. But at the end of the day, they always had to give in to the U.S. because they depended on U.S. security guarantees. China does not. It's now able to finance its own outward expansion, and it will do so, and that's what powers do. So I think the question is, rather than framing it in terms of the Thucydides trap, the question is, can these two very large powers who are economically very closely integrated, can they get along under these new circumstances? And I think the answer is yes, they can if they put their minds to it. Right now, certainly in the U.S., that doesn't seem to be the plan, right? But I don't think there's any inevitability to this. I think the solution to this or the outcome of this is constructed by human activity. There are a lot of variables, and it can go in a lot of different directions, and we don't have to take as our starting point that the default option is some kind of armed conflict. I think that is wrong. And I think that's wrong because the entire global system that has been built up and that China has been integrated into is a very powerful thing. And because China has all of these transnational production supply chains where they're the endpoint, but they depend on components and intermediates coming in from all other countries, and they depend on the ability to export those to other countries. The stakes to them and to anyone else for moving towards a military confrontation are way higher than I think they've ever been in world history. So I think the default starting position is not, oh, we're bound to have a war unless. No, the default position is actually we're in a pretty good state to work this out if we can just tone down the emotions. That's the starting point. Military implications specifically, I think to be very clear on this, China is not interested in a war, right? They saw what happened to Germany. They saw what happened to Japan. They say you tangle military with the United States, that is a very bad idea. And I think that is deeply ingrained in it's a very bad idea to challenge the U.S. military. That generally does not end well. And China is in a stronger position maybe than Germany and Japan was, but it would be very costly. So their strategy very clearly is to incrementally increase their power, both politically and economically, peacefully. And the only place where they have, I think, an offensive military objective is Taiwan, where Taiwan, they view it as part of China, and it needs to be reunified. And there was some speculation in the Chinese blogosphere after Xi Jinping made himself president for life that his next move was going to be to try and take over Taiwan. And that, I think, is the real thing that we need to worry about. Military conflict can clearly be avoided on all other fronts except Taiwan, where China wants it back, and they want it back sooner rather than later. And the United States has given this commitment that they won't allow it to be given back under duress. And that is very, that's potentially worrying. But I think that's really the only flashpoint. North Korea could be a flashpoint if it's really bungled, but that would take extraordinarily bad diplomacy, I think. And I think at the end of the day, there's a convergence of interests in China, between China and the United States, that will keep the North Korea problem contained. So I'm actually not too concerned about that as a flashpoint for armed conflict. I think Taiwan, not now, but some years down the road, is a potential problem there. And then the question was, what happens? Does anything change if Trump is impeached? Yeah, I think the methods and tactics change. But the point I made at the outset was that this change of attitude in the U.S. towards China is not something that Donald Trump came up with, and it's not something that Robert Lighthizer came up with. This is shared by everybody in the foreign policy establishment in the United States, that China is a problem, that the past approach, even if it worked in the past, is not working now, and so a new approach is necessary, and a more robust approach is required, and that the U.S. has to be a little bit more assertive in protecting its national interests. So I don't think that we would be in a somewhat different place if Hillary Clinton were elected, in that she would not have withdrawn from TPP, she would not have imposed steel tariffs on Canada and Mexico and Germany. She would have used different tactics. But I think her basic approach towards China would have been quite aggressive. So I don't think that much changes if Trump gets kicked out, frankly. I think there's a deep American anxiety about losing America's privileged position at the top of the global pecking order. And anyone who wants to get elected to high office in the United States is going to have to cater to that anxiety.
Do we have time for one more question? I have one myself.
Okay, and then I'm sure Ambassador Castroneves has something that he would like to ask. So I would be very interested to hear from both of you.
You can go first.
My question has already been put forward without my consent by Roberto Fent. Was about the Thucydides.
That's right.
Yes. It was about the Thucydides trap.
Yeah.
I would divide, and some people have already divided in 4 parts. And one is the diplomatic scenario, the other one is the economic scenario,
Right.
the military scenario, and finally the technology or
Right.
technological scenario.
Right.
And this one, in my view, is the only one where there would be a sort of a zero-sum game. So therefore, the gains of one side would correspond to losses on the other side.
Wait, which one?
The technology.
The technology. And why is that?
And you mentioned that when you said that the U.S. might be willing to go into a technological Cold War.
Right.
Because I don't see the military and the diplomats and the businessmen,
Right.
they want to accommodate
Right.
and transform the relationship in sort of a
Right.
win-win situation.
Right.
That would be much more problematic in the technological
Right.
field.
Yeah. Yeah, well, let me address that. That's because I have some material on that. Can we put up the presentation again? Because I think you're right that this is probably the most, in many ways, the most difficult part of the problem. And, okay, so what I think is going on here is United States, I think, has a mental map that looks something like this graph. This is manufacturing, share of global manufacturing value added. You go back 15 years, the U.S. was by a wide margin the biggest manufacturer in the world. They accounted for over a quarter of manufacturing capacity, right? That has now shifted. China now accounts for a quarter, more and rising, and the U.S. share has fallen to the second place. And so I think this helps explain why there's this obsession with manufacturing in the discourse in the Trump administration. And it helps explain, and it's linked to this technology thing. Now, there's this idea that China is galloping ahead of the U.S. in technology, and we have to stop them before they win. So the first thing I would say is I don't think technology is a race where there's a finish line and then you cross it and you win and everyone else loses. It's a dynamic, ever-evolving process where there are multiple winners of different aspects, and because technology is as much about the diffusion as the creation, you can be a winner even if you don't create technology if you learn how to use it properly. So I think this whole notion of, oh, we're in some kind of, which is very popular and people are talking this way, that we are in a zero-sum race for winning the AI race, for example, that literally makes no sense to me. I do not understand what that means, and I think if you try and unpack that, it is impossible to assign a logical or rational meaning to that, right? It's a talking point to justify something else. But furthermore, it is just not true that China is a technological leader. They've made enormous technological progress, gigantic. It's very impressive. But I've looked at several indicators of Chinese technological prowess, and none of them tell me that China is a leader today, right? So here's the first one. It's a little bit complicated, but basically what we say, what we look at is we say, if you have technology, one of the ways you benefit from this is you license your patents to people in other countries and you gain income from that. So the United States last year, or in 2016, earned $125 billion from intellectual property licensing. They paid out $40 billion. So the U.S. has a surplus on its intellectual property account of $80 billion a year, right? This is not something you will hear Bob Lighthizer talking about. Europe runs a big deficit because they license a lot from the U.S., but they also earn a lot. They have a big IP licensing business, $125 billion a year. Japan, much smaller economy, $25 billion in big surplus. There is a gray bar here for China, but you could barely see it, right? China pays more in intellectual property licensing fees than Japan does, almost as much as Japan and Germany combined, but they earn very little. So if China really had this gigantic technological base that was really very valuable, they would probably be earning more money off it than they are, right? If you express this as a ratio, if you say take the payments that you earn, divide them by what you pay out, the United States every year for the last 20 years basically has earned $3 in intellectual property fees for every dollar that it pays out. Japan and Germany have been gaining ground. They're both now at about 2 to 1. China earns a nickel, 5 cents of intellectual property fees for every dollar that it pays out, and this has not moved, right? So you would have thought, oh, if China was gaining ground, if it was getting closer to the technological frontier, this line would at least be moving up, but it's not. Corporate R&D in technology-intensive companies. This is a sample of 1,000 companies picked by PwC, global companies that are at the leading edge of technology. And we look at how much are these companies spending in research and development as a share of their revenues. Chinese companies, big gains. They used to spend only about 1% of revenues. Now it's up to over 2%, but they're still well behind. And actually, the intensity of R&D at top U.S. companies is accelerating faster in the United States than it is in China. So is China really a global leader? I don't see it. Exports of high technology goods. This is Chinese government data. The percentage of Chinese high-tech exports produced by domestically owned firms. For all high-tech products, it's less than 20%. That means 80% of high-tech exports out of China are produced by foreign-owned firms. And there's only a handful of sectors like medical equipment and telecoms equipment where it's above 20%. Almost everything else you look, it's much lower. So the point I want to make on this is, first of all, I reject the suggestion that technology is really a zero-sum game. I acknowledge that it's being characterized that way, and a lot of policy is being built on that assumption, and that's an important fact. But as an analyst, I say that's a false assumption, and we should fight against that. And then I also challenge the assumption that China is already at some point of technological leadership, and there's urgent action that we need to do to prevent them somehow beating the U.S. in some kind of technological race. There is no evidence for that, none whatsoever. So there are issues there. I think Made in China 2025 is a deeply problematic thing. It's very mercantilist. There are lots of Chinese bad practices. There are forced technology transfers, compulsory licensing. There are a lot of specific problems that must be dealt with. But we should not characterize them in this apocalyptic way where we are 2 steps away from all being under the heel of the Chinese jackboot. I think that's just a grotesque exaggeration. So, Sergio, do you want to have the last word? Or the last question? Oh, there's one.
One. Okay, you can go ahead and then I close.
Okay.
But wait for the mic. Where's the mic? Where's the girl? Oh, you want to make a question?
Yes.
Yes, please.
All right, go.
Yeah,
Go
okay.
ahead. And
So
then,
we'll do
all right.
two, and then conclude.
In your opinion, which measures can a country as Brazil take against such rivalry? And what would be the best answer in regarding of that?
Yep, good question. So then Norman and I'll answer them together.
Thank you. Arthur, I mean, there's one thing that, I mean, the Chinese are making massive investments in technical education.
Yep.
The United States, I mean, if you read the press, I mean, is on a downward path in technical education.
Yep.
How important is this?
Okay, so first on what should Brazil do in reaction to this rivalry that's going? How should they respond? Stay calm, I would say, is number one. I think that's what we all need to do. And I think, you know, the key is we have a very robust set of global institutions that work extremely well most of the time to create an environment for economic growth and cooperation. And I think to the extent possible, the most important role for countries like Brazil is to participate actively in these forums, whether it's G20 or the WTO or other organizations, and try to work diplomatically for solutions that will preserve the existing institutions but make them work better and make them more representative, right? And that it sounds simple. It's actually a very tall ask, and we have a very experienced diplomat here who I think could afterwards tell you just how hard a job that really is and how frustrating. But I think that is number one. And the number two message, which ties to Norman's question, is self-strengthening, right? At the end of the day, most of a nation's economic destiny, particularly for big countries like the United States, China, and Brazil, is determined at home. It's not foreigners who determine your economic destiny, it's yourself. And I've been coming to Brazil for 10 years, and I've always been delivering a variant of the same message because people are saying, oh, wow, it's great, we're selling all this iron ore to China. Can we sell more iron ore to China? Or when the iron ore runs out, what's the next thing we can sell to China? And my answer is, look, wait, you're thinking about it the wrong way. Brazil needs to look at its own tax system, its own investment system, its own governance system, and make those the best they can. And then you'll be able to profit from the China trade however it evolves over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But if you don't do those things, then you'll lose out. And the message is the same in the US. I think you're absolutely right, Norman. China invests heavily in education at all levels. The United States, we've just had a teachers' strike in the state of West Virginia because the teachers who are the 49th worst paid, the 49th best paid teachers in the U.S., they rank 49 out of 50 states in how little they're paid. They were asking for a 5% increase in pay, their first increase in many years. We have other states which literally have cut public education from 5 days to 4 because they're not willing to fund it. This is insane, right? If you are serious about saying we are in a technological race against China, the first thing that you should be doing is investing much more at home in all levels of education and in technical education and in R&D and in mechanisms to improve the quality of your human capital. And so most of the things right now in the United States that are being blamed on China or on bad trade agreements, it's not the fault of China or bad trade agreements. It's the fault of bad policy in the United States, which has failed to take the profits that have been generated from globalization and plow them back into sensible investments at home. And so the result is that 80% of the U.S. population has been left behind, and they have not profited as much as they should have, or not profited at all from the global system. And they got mad about it, and they elected Donald Trump because they thought the system was rigged against them and he would break it. And that wasn't, in a long-term sense, that wasn't maybe a rational thing to do, but it was very understandable because the United States has failed in that regard to do the things that it needs to do. So that's where I would like to leave it, basically, from my side, is just to say all of these problems that we've talked about are real, but at the end of the day, for most countries, the biggest problems and the biggest solutions are always at home. And if you want to have better and more fair relations with your trading partners, the first step you need to do is to do everything possible to strengthen your domestic system so that when you negotiate, you're negotiating from a position of strength, not weakness.
All right, last things. Well, I'm still struggling to understand how was it possible for Xi Jinping in such a short period of time to concentrate so much power in his hands without apparently facing serious resistance. And now doubling down on that and imposing discipline on a party discipline on all Chinese officials, from the central level to the local level. So are we missing something in this? I mean, is his power is really, he's not threatened in a way that is not seen yet.
Right.
Because it's hard to buy the story that he's the almighty,
Right.
and no one can challenge him, and then there is no discontent. I'm not mentioning Chinese society as a whole, but within the Communist Party elite in rank and file.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question. And I think the honest answer is that there's a lot we just do not know because the Chinese political system is a black box. So it actually is impossible to answer that question. We don't know exactly how he managed to pull it off, how much resistance there was, how he neutralized that resistance, and how much is left. We have only scattered indications.
What is your gut feeling?
Yeah, but I'll make a couple of observations. So first of all, I think it's important to recognize that when he came into power in 2012, he did have a mandate from a big section of the Communist Party elite who felt that under Hu Jintao, the nation had sort of gone off the rails, that the government was not working, that there were real threats to the stability of communist rule. So he came in with a mandate from a big chunk of the leadership to clean things up, to tighten the ship, to crack down on corruption and improve discipline. So a lot of things that he's done were the task that he was given by his colleagues, right? Now, I think he's gone beyond his remit because I don't think anyone had said, oh, and by the way, make yourself president for life. I don't think that was anyone's plan but his own. And we have a lot of indirect evidence to suggest that many people are discontented with this, that there is significant resistance, maybe too strong a word, but unhappiness with the path that he's taken. I think there's a diversity of voices within the Communist Party. Many of them have believed for a long time that it needs to move in a more liberal, open direction in the long run for rule to be sustainable. So there is definitely not a unified view within the Communist Party that, oh, this is the great way to do it, and there's no questions about it. I think there's a lot of quiet dissent. But I think the evidence that we have is that he's a very skillful and strategic politician, and that he has made the cost of dissent so high that basically people are shutting up. And the reality is, like all Chinese leaders, you get a lot of legitimacy through competence. So if he mismanages the economy and things start going downhill, then he could be in big trouble. But right now, he's been managing the economy, or his lieutenants have been managing the economy very well, and China is a much stronger, better position now than it was 6 years ago when Hu Jintao left office, I think by almost every measure. So he can say, all right, you don't like what I'm doing, what's not to like, right? Everything's going fine, be quiet. And again, that makes it very costly for people to oppose it because there's nothing that you can point to that is destructive in the short term. You can just say vaguely, oh, well, it would be better if we had a more open system 40 years from now. That's not an argument that in this system is going to have a lot of purchase right now. So I think we're going to have to live with Xi Jinping for a long time. I think he does have a very competent cadre of lieutenants who will manage things well for him. And the only way that this would start to erode is if you start to see a real deterioration, either in economic performance or in some other kind of social good that people put a high value on. And it becomes less obvious that the Communist Party is really effective. If there's a loss of effectiveness, then I think his legitimacy goes down, and the space for alternative or rival positions opens up. But I'm not expecting that, certainly in the next 5 years.
Arthur, thank you so much for this comprehensive, well-informed, well-thought presentation. I hope to see you sooner than later.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're always invited.
Thank you very much.